On the night my husband took his last breath, after 33 years of marriage, he whispered words that froze my soul. "Forgive me, Ellie. George is waiting for me." But George had been dead for over 3 decades. From that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life began to unravel. If stories like this touch your heart, I'd be grateful if you subscribed or shared a comment below. It helps me keep telling these true journeys of love, loss, and strength. Tell me, what would you have felt hearing those words in the dark of a hospital room? May your evening be gentle and your heart at peace. The town where I was born and lived most of my life sat on the slow, winding banks of the Yazoo River in northern Mississippi, where the air in summer carried the sweet weight of magnolias, and in winter the fog rolled in low and heavy across the water. By the 1990s, it was a place most travelers passed by without stopping, a quiet town where time seemed to have stalled, where everyone knew the faces in the pews on Sunday and the names on every mailbox. It was in this town that I built my life, raised my children, and held on to the belief that the ordinary could be beautiful. The pharmacy on Main Street, with its red brick front and squeaky screen door, was as much the heart of the town as the church steeple that pierced the skyline. And my husband, James Walker, was the man behind the counter, always in a white coat, always with a kind word, always steady as the Mississippi heat. I was just a girl in 1964 when I walked down the aisle of St. Andrew's Church in a borrowed satin gown, trembling as I looked up at James, who stood tall in a black suit that had seen better days. He was 22, with a lean frame, sandy brown hair neatly combed, and hazel eyes that had a habit of softening whenever he smiled. To the town, he was the bright young pharmacist with a future ahead of him. To me, he was the promise of stability, a man who would build a life beside me, brick by brick, in a world that often felt too uncertain. We had 3 children, Teresa in 1965, Joshua in 1967, and Martha in 1970, and our little home near the edge of town grew noisy with laughter, arguments, and the smell of cornbread baking in the oven. Life was not easy, but it was the kind of simple that lulled you into gratitude. Every Sunday, without fail, James rose before dawn, brewed himself a pot of black coffee, and packed his old tackle box and rod into the back of his Chevrolet. He always said he was heading to the river with his old friend, George Miller, a man I had never really met, but whose name was stitched into the fabric of our marriage as surely as if he had sat at our table. James would kiss my forehead gently, call me Ellie in the way only he did, and promise he'd be back before supper. By late afternoon, the children and I would gather on the porch, waiting for him to come rumbling up the gravel drive. Sometimes he came home with a string of catfish, other times with nothing but stories. George's big catch that nearly snapped the line, the one that got away. I believed it all because that's what wives did. Years blurred into decades. James grew from the eager young man I married into a respected figure of the town, the one folks trusted with their prescriptions and their secrets. Our children grew, left for colleges and jobs, and though the house quieted, those Sundays stayed the same. He would leave in the soft light of morning and return smelling faintly of river water, campfire smoke, and something else I never quite named. Sometimes thought it was the scent of freedom, the air of a man who had been somewhere else, but I never asked. My mother had raised me to keep questions folded neatly in silence, and so I did. It was on a warm spring afternoon in 1997, the dogwoods blooming white across the front yard, that everything I believed about my husband, my marriage, and my life began to crack. James had gone out that morning, his fishing rod leaning against his shoulder as casually as ever, but by midday he staggered through our front door, his face pale, his shirt damp with sweat, his hand pressed hard against his chest. I rushed to him, my heart pounding with a fear I hadn't felt since the night my youngest was born. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice ragged, "I don't feel right." I dialed the county hospital, begged for the ambulance, and held him close as we waited for the siren that seemed to take forever. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, cold and impersonal as I sat at his bedside. Machines beeped in rhythm with his weakening heart. Tubes tangled at his side, and I gripped his hand, the same hand that had carried groceries, fixed the leaky roof, held our babies in the dead of night. His eyes flickered open once more, hazel and dimmed, and in a rasp that tore through me, he whispered, "Forgive me, Ellie. George is waiting for me." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. The words fell into the room like stones into water, sending ripples that seemed to warp the air. George, the friend, the fisherman, the man James had claimed to spend every Sunday with for 33 years. But George Miller had died back in the 1960s in a car accident so sudden the whole county had mourned. I remembered the hushed voices, the newspaper clipping, the way neighbors spoke of it briefly and then let the name fade into silence. And yet here, on the edge of death, my husband spoke his name as though George were standing just outside the door, waiting. I sat frozen in that sterile room, his hand growing limp in mine as the monitor stretched into a long, flat tone. All at once, the man I had trusted for my entire adult life was gone, leaving behind not only the ache of loss, but a question that would gnaw at me in every waking moment to come. How could he have spoken of George in that way? How could he have carried a secret so deep that even at the end, it rose to the surface like something too heavy to remain buried? That night, as I walked out of the hospital into the thick Mississippi air, the magnolias heavy with scent and the cicadas buzzing unseen in the trees, I felt the ground shift beneath me. My husband was gone, but in his final breath, he had cracked open a mystery that reached back 3 decades, a secret tethered to the name of a man long buried. And I understood with a chill that would never quite leave me that nothing about the life I thought I knew would ever be the same again. It was a humid July morning when I finally gathered the strength to open the garage, the one place in the house that still smelled of James. The summer cicadas whirred like an endless clock, and the dust motes swirled in the golden light that crept through the small side window. His old tools leaned against the wall, rust freckling their handles, and the fishing rods he always carried on Sundays still rested in the corner. One of them, with a line half tangled, as though he had set it down hurriedly. I stood there with a rag in my hand, my heart pounding, as if I were about to trespass into a private sanctuary that wasn't mine, though I had lived under the same roof for more than 3 decades. On the top shelf, hidden behind paint cans and boxes of nails, I found it, a shoebox tied with string, the word memories written in my husband's neat slanted handwriting across the lid. The letters seemed too deliberate, too careful, as if meant for someone else's eyes, not mine. My fingers trembled as I slid the box down, brushing off the dust that had gathered like a protective skin. I sat on a stool by the workbench, the wood scarred by years of hammering and sanding, and stared at it for a long moment, afraid of what it might hold. The garage was silent save for the distant call of a mourning dove, and I knew I was about to step into a part of James's life I had never been invited to see. When I finally untied the string and lifted the lid, a faint scent of cedar and age escaped, the smell of papers and photographs long hidden. On top lay a stack of black and white pictures, their edges curling from time. The first showed James as a young man, no older than 25, standing proudly beside another man. They were dressed casually, both holding fishing rods, smiling in front of a wooden boat. I turned the photograph over. Written in James's hand were the words, "Me and George, June 1965. I stared at that face. George Miller, lean, dark-haired, his smile shy yet warm, a face I had never seen in person, though I had heard his name countless times. There were more photographs beneath it, all taken around the same period. James and George by the river, laughing, posing with their catches. But as I shuffled through them, something struck me. Every single picture was from the mid-60s. There were no later ones. It was as though time had frozen, as though their friendship had ended suddenly, and yet James had kept it alive in another way. As I placed the photos aside, a folded scrap of newsprint slipped out and fluttered onto the floor. I bent down, my knees stiff, and picked it up. It was a yellowed obituary clipped from the county newspaper, dated July 1965. My breath caught as I read, "George Miller, 25, died yesterday in a tragic automobile accident on Route 49. He leaves behind his young wife, Isora, who is expecting their first child." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. My hands shook so violently I had to steady them on the workbench. George, dead in 1965. Yet James had spent every Sunday since then claiming he was with him by the river. I sank onto the stool, the obituary trembling in my grasp. Memories surged. The countless Sundays he left at dawn, the stories of fish that got away, the smell of campfire smoke on his clothes. How could that have been true if George had been gone for over 30 years? My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time in my life, I felt as though the floor beneath my marriage was not stone but shifting sand. For a long time, I could not bring myself to reach further into the box, but something compelled me. Beneath the photographs and clippings lay a stack of receipts, folded neatly and bound by a rubber band gone brittle with age. I pulled them out and spread them across the bench. They were rent receipts for a small apartment in Jackson, the next town over, dated month after month, year after year, from 1966 all the way to 1997. Each slip bore James's signature. I ran my finger across the ink, faded in some, bold in others, proof of a ritual that had lasted over 3 decades. Confusion tightened around me like a net. Why would my husband, who owned a comfortable home with me in Greenwood, pay for an apartment miles away in Jackson? My chest felt heavy, as though the humid air had thickened with the weight of unanswered questions. And then, at the very bottom of the box, I found the photograph that would undo whatever fragments of certainty I still held. It was a more recent picture, the colors vivid, not black and white. James was in it. Older now, his hair grayer at the temples, his shoulders broader, his face more lined. He was standing beside a woman, her name written on the back in a familiar feminine script. Dolores, me and the kids, 1992. She appeared about my age, her hair pulled back neatly, a soft smile on her lips. And standing with them were 2 young adults, a man and a woman, both bearing the same hazel eyes I had seen in my children, both looking at James with the easy affection of family. I held that photograph until my hands went numb, staring at James's arm draped around the woman's shoulders, the warmth in his smile, the unmistakable intimacy of a man at home. Dolores, 2 grown children, a life I had never known, hidden just 40 miles away. The shoebox sat open on the bench, its contents scattered like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper into the illusion I had called a marriage. And as I looked at that picture, my heart hollowed with a truth I wasn't yet ready to name, but could no longer deny. The street was narrow, shaded by oak trees whose branches bent low over weathered sidewalks, and the air of Jackson carried the faint hum of traffic from a larger road a few blocks away. I walked slowly, my steps heavy on the cracked pavement, clutching the piece of paper with the address written in my hand. The houses were modest, painted in soft blues and yellows, their porches dressed with rocking chairs and wind chimes that clattered in the breeze. My chest tightened as I reached number 47, a pale green townhouse with a small iron gate and a garden that bloomed with geraniums and roses. It was here, in this quiet pocket of the city, that I was about to confront a truth my heart was not ready to accept. She stood in the garden when I arrived, watering a row of marigolds with a green metal can. Dolores Miller, though I didn't know her name yet, looked to be about my age, perhaps late 70s now, but on that day her frame was trim and upright, her silver hair swept neatly into a bun. She wore a light floral dress, the kind you might wear on a warm Sunday afternoon, and her expression was calm, her eyes narrowed in focus on the flowers she tended. For a moment I hesitated by the gate, my hand trembling on the latch, until she looked up and caught my gaze. There was warmth in her eyes, but also the polite distance one gives a stranger. "Can I help you?" she asked, setting the watering can on the ground, her voice steady yet cautious. I pulled a photograph from my handbag, the one that had torn my world open, and held it out through the slats of the gate. "Do you know this man?" My voice quivered, though I tried to keep it firm. She stepped closer, her eyes focusing, and in an instant her face softened, almost glowing with recognition. "Of course," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "That's my husband, Robert. Who are you? A friend of his?" I felt the words strike me like a sudden wind. Robert. My knees threatened to buckle, but I straightened my back, clutched the photograph tighter, and answered with all the strength I had left. He was my husband, too, for 33 years. Only to me, his name was James. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy as a storm about to break. Dolores's face drained of color, and her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes darted back to the photograph, then to me, searching for some hint of falsehood, some cruel mistake. But there was none. Her breath hitched, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "No, that can't be. We were married in the church down the road, 1967. He's the father of my children." My body trembled, but I did not look away. "And he married me in 1964, in Greenwood. We raised 3 children of our own. For 33 years, I believed every Sunday he was fishing with his old friend, George Miller." Her brow furrowed at the name, confusion crossing her features. She gestured for me to come inside, her voice breaking. Please, let's sit down." The apartment was modest, filled with sunlight and the scent of fresh bread cooling on the counter. Family photographs lined the walls, birthdays, graduations, vacations, and in nearly all of them stood the man I had called James, smiling as though he belonged wholly here. Dolores poured us each a cup of coffee with trembling hands, her face pale but composed, her posture stiff as if holding herself together by sheer will. "He always said his work took him away during the week," she whispered, staring into the dark liquid in her cup. "Said he traveled across the state selling pharmaceutical supplies. Sundays, though. Sundays were for us. He said the rest of the week belonged to duty, but Sundays were ours." I let out a bitter laugh that quickly broke into a sob. And to me, Sundays were the only day he took for himself. He said he went fishing with George, but George has been dead since 1965. I found the obituary tucked inside a shoebox in our garage. Her eyes widened at that, horror dawning in her expression. She stood suddenly, walked to a bookshelf, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound album. Setting it between us, she opened to the first page. Photographs stared up. James, or Robert, as she knew him, with Dolores and their children, a daughter with bright eyes and chestnut hair, a son with his father's same strong jaw. They smiled at birthday cakes, waved at the camera on family trips, posed in front of a Christmas tree. The images burned in me, each one proof of a life lived alongside mine, a life that mirrored and rivaled the one I had believed was whole. And then Dolores brought out something else, a journal, the cover worn smooth, the pages filled with his familiar script. "He left this in the nightstand," she said softly, sliding it toward me. My hands shook as I opened it, the ink sprawling across the yellowed pages, words written in a rhythm I recognized, and there, line after line, he described fishing trips with George, long conversations by the riverbank, laughter over campfires, reflections shared in the quiet of dawn. Page after page, year after year. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "But George was gone." Dolores nodded, her lips pressed tight, her eyes shining with disbelief. We read in silence for a long while, the weight of every sentence pressing down like stones on our chests. And as the light in the room shifted toward evening, one truth became undeniable. James, or Robert, had not simply lied. He had lived as two men, moving between two homes, two wives, two families, as though bound to both and yet wholly belonging to neither. When I finally closed the journal, my hands trembling on the worn leather, I could scarcely breathe. The man we both had loved had carried not only a secret, but an entire double life, as though he had divided his very soul. The journal lay open between us, its pages yellowed, the ink sometimes smudged, sometimes sharp as though he had pressed the pen too hard. The air inside the small living room was heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the mantel. I could feel Dolores beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breath uneven. Together we leaned forward, two women bound by grief and betrayal, reading words that belonged to a man we had loved but never truly known. In those first entries, written neatly in the mid-60s, he was James Walker, the town's respectable pharmacist, the man who stood behind the counter in pressed shirts and polished shoes. He wrote about the pride of buying the drugstore, about the smell of oak shelves freshly varnished, about the trust of neighbors who came to him for medicine and advice. He spoke of me, Eleanor, as the wife who kept his home in order, the children we raised, the image of stability he worked so hard to preserve. It was the portrait of a man admired, needed, respected, a man tethered by duty. But just a few pages later, in entries penned with a looser hand, the voice shifted. There he was not James, but Robert Miller, an easygoing man who claimed freedom like breath itself, who laughed more, who worked less, who found joy in little things like grilling on the porch or taking drives through the countryside. With Dolores, he was the man who lived lighter, who shed the weight of expectations and embraced the role of husband and father in a humbler, less scrutinized way. He wrote of her kindness, her patience, the way she brightened rooms with her laughter. He belonged to both worlds, and yet to neither fully. The most unsettling lines were the ones where George appeared, not as a memory, but as if he were still alive. "George and I went down to the river today," one entry read, written in 1972, years after the obituary had declared George dead. "He listened when I said I could no longer tell Eleanor everything. He reminded me that some truths are too heavy for the living." The words chilled me, for they carried the intimacy of confession, but to a ghost, or perhaps to a fragment of his own conscience, he had given George's name. Entry after entry across decades, he described these conversations with his lost friend, weaving George into the very fabric of his double life. Dolores pressed her hand to her lips, whispering, "All these years, he wasn't just lying to us, he was lying to himself." Her voice trembled, and I reached for the journal, flipping through more pages, though my hands shook as if the leather binding burned. The further we read, the more the lines blurred. By the late 80s and early 90s, his handwriting grew less steady, and his thoughts began to stumble over themselves. One entry read, "Terry is thriving at school. No, wait, Janelle is the one graduating soon." Another page, "I promised Dolores we'd take Robert Jr. fishing, but Ellie is expecting me home with Base for supper." The names tangled, the children of one household seeping into the margins of the other, until it was clear that age, guilt, and time had begun to unravel the careful partitions he had built. Dolores's fingers brushed mine as we turned to the final pages. There was weariness in his words, the exhaustion of a man who knew the walls of his divided world were crumbling. George says I cannot carry this much longer. My chest feels heavy every night. I fear one day I'll slip and call Eleanor by Dolores's name, or worse, look my children in the eyes and not know which ones they are. The lines blurred as my eyes filled with tears, for it was no longer the confident script of a man in control, but the shaking letters of someone unraveling, trapped in his own deception. I closed the book slowly, my breath shallow. Dolores sat back in her chair, her face pale, her eyes hollow as though part of her had been scraped away. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the only sound the rustle of the pages settling. It was clear. He had not merely been unfaithful. He had split himself into two men, one carrying duty and respect, the other living as though he could outrun responsibility. At last, Dolores spoke, her voice low but steady. We can't keep this to ourselves. The children, they deserve to know who their father truly was. Her words pierced me because they echoed my own thoughts I had resisted for days. Yet the fear pressed in too. Fear of shattering what remained of their memories, fear of destroying the image they cherished. My throat tightened as I whispered, but if we tell them everything they believed about him, everything they built their lives upon, it could all collapse. Dolores looked at me with eyes that had cried too much already, but now glowed with a fierce resolve. And if we don't, then we're no better than him. We'd be living his lie. The room was heavy with that truth. I held the journal close to my chest, as though it might steady me, but the weight only deepened the ache inside. We sat in silence, two women who had loved the same man, now bound by the same impossible choice. And as the sun dipped low beyond the window, casting long shadows across the floor, I realized that the next step was inevitable. We would have to tell our children, but how and at what cost remained a darkness neither of us yet dared to face. I gathered my 3 children in the living room one quiet Saturday evening, the kind when the cicadas hummed beyond the screened porch and the Mississippi air carried a heaviness that no breeze could lift. Teresa, my eldest, sat with her hands folded neatly, her chin raised as though bracing herself for bad news. Joshua, steady and analytical, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, studying me with the cool intensity of someone accustomed to solving problems. Martha, my youngest, paced the room with restless energy, her arms crossed tight across her chest, suspicion already flickering in her eyes. I could feel my throat close, but I knew silence would be a deeper betrayal than the truth. I told them, slowly, carefully, each word dragged from a place inside me that still bled. I laid the journal on the coffee table, its leather worn, the pages edged in years of dust, and said the words I never thought I'd utter. Your father was not only my husband. He lived another life. He was someone else to another family. For a moment, only the clock answered, ticking with cruel indifference, until Teresa's breath hitched and her hands flew to her mouth as though to hold back a cry. No, she whispered, shaking her head, her face pale. Daddy would never. Not him. Not the man who taught us to pray at night, who fixed the broken fence in the rain, who never missed Sunday dinner. Her denial was fierce, her eyes glistening with tears that refused to fall. She clung to the memory of the father she adored, unwilling to let it collapse beneath the weight of my confession. Joshua reached for the journal with a steady hand, his expression hard, his jaw set. He flipped through the pages silently, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the familiar handwriting. At last, he exhaled sharply, the kind of sigh that carried both recognition and surrender. It's his, he said flatly, laying the book back down. Every loop, every curve of the letters. It's Dad's hand. There's no denying it. The confirmation spoken aloud landed like a hammer blow, the last refuge of hope crumbling to dust. Martha, who had been pacing like a caged storm, spun toward me, her eyes blazing. So all those Sundays, all those stories about fishing with George, it was a lie? He was living with someone else while we sat here like fools? Her voice cracked with rage, her fists clenched at her sides. He betrayed us, Mama. He betrayed you. He was a coward and a liar, and I'll never forgive him. Her anger burned so hot it seemed to fill the whole room, and I let her words strike me, knowing they were not only hers, but the cry of every wound I had been carrying in silence. While my children wrestled with their grief, across town Dolores faced her own trial. In a quiet kitchen scented with strong coffee and fresh cornbread, she called her grown children to the table. Janet, her daughter, elegant in a pale blouse, sat stiff-backed, suspicion flickering in her dark eyes. Philip, broader in frame, his hands calloused from years of work, folded his arms as though he already knew trouble was coming. Dolores, her voice trembling but determined, told them the same truth. Their father, Robert, was not only Robert, he was James Walker, too, and for decades he had walked between two lives. The reaction was immediate. Janet gasped, her composure shattering, and she cried out, "Mama, how could you not have known? How could we have been blind all these years?" Her voice broke with hurt, with the fear that her whole childhood had been built on sand. Philip's silence was more chilling. He stared at the floor for a long moment, then rose suddenly, his chair scraping against the tile. "I need air," he muttered, his voice low, thick with unspoken rage. He walked out into the night, the screen door slamming behind him, leaving Dolores trembling in the wake of her children's grief. Days later, Dolores and I found ourselves face to face again, not as rivals, but as women carrying the same unbearable weight. We sat together on her porch, the air sweet with the scent of magnolia, and shared the stories of our children's pain, the disbelief, the anger, the hollow silence. We held one another's gaze and realized that if we allowed this betrayal to define us, then James, or Robert, would win even in death. It was Dolores who spoke first, her voice low but steady. "What if we take this truth, as bitter as it is, and make something new of it?" I frowned, confused, until she leaned forward, her eyes shining with a fierce kind of hope. "A restaurant, Ellie. A place by the river. He spent his life hiding behind the lie of fishing trips. Let's turn it into something real. Seafood, fresh and honest. Something that belongs to us, not to him." At first I laughed, bitter and hollow, but the idea planted itself like a seed in parched soil. A place of our own, a future not defined by the man who deceived us, but by the resilience we found in his wake. Slowly, I nodded. If we do this, it won't be for him. It will be for us, for our children, to prove we are more than what he left us. Dolores reached for my hand, and for the first time since the truth had shattered our lives, I felt the faintest stirrings of possibility. Months later, after sleepless nights of planning and work, the little seafood restaurant stood ready, its doors polished, its sign newly painted with the words, "Rivers Catch." On opening day, families from both towns came, drawn by curiosity and the scent of fried catfish and shrimp gumbo drifting into the street. The children, still wary but united in their own strange kinship, helped serve and greet customers. Dolores and I moved through the dining room side by side, our steps careful but certain, as though we had walked this path together all our lives. And then, just as the hum of voices began to settle, the door opened. A man stepped inside, tall, but stooped with age, leaning on a polished cane. His hair was snow white, his suit pressed, though worn at the elbows, and his eyes, sharp, searching, swept the room until they found me. He paused, then spoke in a voice both firm and lined with years. "Mrs. Walker?" he asked. "My name is Henry Miller. I am George's father." The room seemed to hush, the clatter of dishes fading into silence. Dolores gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. My breath caught in my throat, for in that moment I knew the past had come knocking once again, carrying truths yet untold. The old man eased himself into a chair by the window, the polished cane resting across his knees, his hands trembling slightly, yet steady enough to unfold the story we had waited our whole lives to hear. His voice, deepened by age but still clear, carried the rhythm of the river outside, the same river that had been the backdrop of all our lies and all our truths. "When George died in that accident," he began, eyes glistening beneath his heavy brows, "James was never the same. He came to me once, a young man hollowed by grief, and told me he couldn't bear to let my boy go. So he created Robert, a man who could still fish with George, talk with him, keep him alive in his own way. It was madness, maybe, but also love, twisted into something he could not control." The words fell like stones into the silence, rippling through me and Dolores until neither of us could find air to speak. After a long pause, the old man reached into his worn leather satchel, pulling out a book bound in cracked brown cover, its corners softened by time. He placed it gently on the table between us like an offering at an altar. "This belonged to George," he said softly. "I kept it after the funeral, unable to part with it. But it doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to you two, because you're the ones carrying what he and James could never finish." Dolores touched the book first, her fingers trembling as though the leather might burn her skin. I followed, the weight of it grounding me in a way nothing else had since James's death. We opened it slowly, and there, on the yellowed pages, were George's dreams written in a neat, hopeful hand. He wrote of opening a small eatery by the river, a place where fishermen and travelers could rest, eat fresh catfish and cornbread, and share their stories. He dreamed of a place called the Fisherman, where laughter would rise as steadily as the scent of fried hush puppies, and children would grow up knowing the taste of river life. Dolores pressed her hand to her mouth, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. I could not hold mine back either, for in that moment we understood that what we had thought of as our own fragile act of survival was, in truth, a continuation of George's unfinished dream. From then on, the restaurant was no longer just ours. It was a legacy. The sign we had painted gleamed brighter than ever, and the tables filled with families who came not only for the shrimp gumbo and fried catfish, but for the warmth that seemed to radiate from our walls. On busy Sundays, I watched as my children and Dolores's worked side by side, their movements awkward at first, then gradually fluid, like siblings who had always known each other. Teresa brought her gentle patience to the front of the house, guiding guests with a smile that softened hearts. Joshua, ever practical, balanced the books, making sure every bill was paid, every receipt in place. Martha, fiery as always, argued over menu choices, but worked the register with a fierce dedication that made me proud. On Dolores's side, Janet decorated the tables with wildflowers she picked each morning, her touch giving the dining room a homely grace. Philip, broad-shouldered and quiet, grilled the fish with steady hands, his silence now less heavy, more rooted. Slowly, these children, bound by blood through betrayal, began to call one another brother, sister, friend. There were awkward dinners, shared laughter, and even moments when grief broke them down. But always they came back to the river, to the fisherman, where they found pieces of healing none of us had expected. Some nights when the rush of customers had faded and only the crickets sang beyond the porch, Dolores and I sat together with a pot of coffee, looking out at the dark waters. We spoke of the past less and less, of the pain that had first bound us. Instead, we spoke of recipes, of the new dock being built downriver, of the grandchildren who were already learning to set tables and peel shrimp. Life had grown around our wounds like ivy over stone, softening the edges without erasing the scars. The old man, George's father, visited often in those first months. He became something of a fixture, sitting near the window with his cane, sipping chowder and watching with quiet pride. "You've done what they never could," he told us once. "You've turned grief into a living thing. You've given my boy's dream a home." His eyes, weary yet shining, gave me comfort I had not known I needed. When he finally passed a few years later, we placed a small plaque by the door of the restaurant, in memory of George Miller, whose dream lives on. Years passed, and the fisherman grew into more than a restaurant. It became a gathering place for the towns along the river, a bridge between two families once divided, a testament that even brokenness can bear fruit. Dolores and I aged gently, our hair silver, our steps slower, but our hearts lighter than we ever thought possible. We had been wives deceived, mothers wounded, but we became women who built something that would outlast us. Now, at 78, as I sit by the window of the apartment above the restaurant, watching the sunset bleed across the Mississippi sky, I think of James, or Robert, or whoever he truly was. I do not excuse him, and I do not forget. But I understand now that out of his shattered spirit came a chance for us to rebuild, to reclaim what he broke, and shape it into something true. I whisper the words to myself, words that I know will one day echo in the hearts of my children and grandchildren. Even in betrayal, we found strength. Even in loss, we found a new beginning. Sometimes life takes us down roads we never meant to travel. We carry wounds we didn't choose, and we learn truths that leave us trembling. Yet within that brokenness, if we're willing to keep walking, there can be quiet moments of grace, moments where love in all its imperfect forms finds a way to grow again. This story is not about what was lost, but about the courage to rise, to rebuild, and to allow compassion to shape what remains. As you let these words settle, I invite you to pause and reflect on your own journey, the bridges you've crossed, the storms you've endured, the gentle hands that lifted you when you thought you couldn't stand again. Stories like these remind us that even in the twilight of our years, new beginnings can still unfold. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If this touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you subscribed or left a quiet note in the comments. May peace and kindness walk beside you wherever tomorrow takes you.